When you hear the name Napoleon Bonaparte, what comes to mind? Probably cannons, epic battles, maybe that famous hat. But what if I told you his real conquests, the ones that are still shaping our world today, weren't won on the battlefield at all? Let's get into it.
So that brings us to the big question, the one people have been arguing about for over 2 centuries. Was this guy a liberator, spreading the ideals of the French Revolution across a continent stuck in the past? Or was he a tyrant, an emperor whose ambition cost millions of lives? The truth is, well, it's incredibly complicated. And frankly, that's what makes him so fascinating.
Because his empire wasn't just held together with bayonets. It was built with something far more permanent: laws, administrators, and a completely new plan for how to run a country. And that's really what we're digging into today. We're going beyond the wars to look at the nuts and bolts of his empire, because the real story isn't just about how he conquered Europe, it's about how he tried to completely rewire it.
All right, so what was the grand design? You have to remember, Napoleon was a product of the French Revolution. He looked out at Europe and saw a continent of old, creaky monarchies and outdated feudal rules. His vision was to tear all that down and rebuild it in the image of a modern, rational France.
And honestly, the sheer scale of his ambition here is just staggering. This was never just a land grab. He was thinking so much bigger. He wanted to create a whole new European order, a kind of commonwealth of nations, all running on the same modern principles, with Paris, naturally, as the center of the universe. The absolute cornerstone of this entire vision was the Napoleonic Code. You can think of this document as a wrecking ball aimed at the old world. It just smashed through centuries of aristocratic privilege and confusing local laws. In their place, it created one single, uniform system where, on paper at least, every citizen was equal. This was literally the operating system for his new Europe.
Okay, so a grand vision is one thing. A new legal code is another. But how do you actually control an entire continent? How do you make that machine run? Napoleon's answer was a marvel of administrative engineering, all designed for maximum efficiency and absolute top-down control.
You see, his empire wasn't just one big blob. It was a really sophisticated, layered system. You had the inner core, the annexed lands, which were basically just absorbed into France. Then, the next ring out were the conquered countries, satellite states run by his brothers or his most loyal generals. And on the outer edge, you had the allied countries, who kept their own rulers, but, let's be honest, they did whatever Napoleon told them to.
And this shows you exactly how the power flowed. It was a straight line down. Orders started with Napoleon himself in Paris. They went out to his hand-picked prefects. These were his eyes and ears in every single region. And from there, down to thousands of local mayors. The chain of command was crystal clear. As one historian put it, every official was exclusively the government's man. No ambiguity there. The whole system really was like a spider's web, with Paris at the center. And it was even cleverer than that, because he didn't rely on just one chain of command. He deliberately set up parallel structures, the civil government, the police, and the army, and had them all report back to him independently. He actually encouraged them to clash a little bit, just to make sure no one person or group ever got powerful enough to challenge him. So that's the blueprint, the machinery of the empire. But what did it actually feel like to be one of the 50 million people living under Napoleonic rule? This is where we get right to the heart of the paradox. I mean, this image really captures it perfectly. There were 2 faces to Napoleon's rule. On one hand, you had the enlightened modernizer, bringing rational laws and sweeping away feudalism. And on the other, you have the authoritarian emperor, whose entire empire was built on force and made relentless demands of its people. And you can see that conflict right here. For every ideal, there was a harsh reality. The promise of equality came with a powerful, heavy-handed police force. The ideal of a meritocracy was paid for with crushing taxes to fund the war machine. And the end of feudalism came at the brutal cost of forced conscription, which tore hundreds of thousands of young men away from their homes. And this wasn't just some abstract tension. It played out in daily life. Take a city like Amsterdam. Napoleon actually named it the 3rd capital of the empire, right after Paris and Rome. But trying to impose this rigid top-down French system on a city with its own deep-rooted independent traditions, it created constant friction between the ambitions of the central government and the realities of local life. So what happens when you try to impose a modern, centralized system on millions of people who didn't really ask for it?
Well, you get resistance, and not just from enemy armies, but from the ordinary people themselves. Opposition popped up everywhere, in all kinds of ways. It looked like young men hiding from the draft collectors. It looked like smugglers breaking the economic blockade against Britain. It even looked like local mayors, the guys who were supposed to be enforcing his will, quietly defying orders from Paris to protect their own communities. It was a constant, low-level war against the state.
A perfect example of a grand policy that just completely backfired was his continental system. The goal was simple: bankrupt Great Britain by blocking it from trading with Europe. The result? It was an economic disaster for France and its allies. It caused far more hardship on the continent than it did in Britain, fueling even more anger and smuggling.
So in 1815, Napoleon's empire finally collapses. The armies are defeated, he's exiled to a rock in the middle of the Atlantic. End of story, right? Not even close. In a strange and really profound way, his ghost still haunts the very foundations of modern Europe. And this is the crucial point. The political map that Napoleon drew, all those new borders, it was erased almost immediately after his defeat. But the institutional map, the map of the mind, that proved incredibly durable. His template for a modern, centralized state with professional bureaucrats, a single legal code, and efficient tax system, that survived. In fact, it became the foundation for the European countries we know today. You want one stunning example of that lasting impact? Before Napoleon, the area we now call Germany was a chaotic patchwork of over 300 tiny, independent states. He swept them all away and consolidated them into just 39. That one move completely changed the political landscape and directly paved the way for German unification a few decades later.
And this quote just sums it all up perfectly. The system he created wasn't democratic, not by a long shot. It was enlightened authoritarianism. Powerful, efficient, and rational, sure, but with absolutely no room for democracy. And that powerful, centralized model became the default blueprint for the modern nation-state, not just in Europe, but eventually all around the world.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Napoleon was a liberator, and he was a tyrant. His project brought modernity, but it demanded total obedience. And it leaves us with this enormous question that echoes through history and one we're still grappling with. What is the true price of progress?